Winning Side, a series of dialogues about winning themes such as diversity and inclusion, creating a social impact, and leading change. Welcome to the first episode of The Winning Side. The episode focuses on diversity and inclusion. Our title is Women in the Boardroom. The episode is based on a live event at the University of Cambridge Library and is sponsored by the Rising Tide Initiative. Highlights of the event are as follows.
So are our boards representative enough?
The boards now play a fundamentally different and absolutely essential role.
Her cabinet, so her executive officers, and all but one are male.
Identified with a bit of imposter syndrome.
There's a special place in hell for women, senior women that don't support other women for the organisation. I think, that's a big responsibility.
Profit board service can be a brilliant way to...
The image that we have of boards is old, grey-haired men.
A lack of board diversity is often a symptom of other problems within the organisation.
Hello and good evening. We need to talk diversity and inclusion. I'm Sara and I'm a banker in London, but I'm originally from Pakistan. I'm currently doing an executive MBA at the University of Cambridge and I'm a women's officer at the Graduate Union, was for 2019. So today I would like to bring together our amazing panelists and start a dialogue as to why do we need diversity in the boardrooms. Our event would start off with we'll introduce our panelists to come on stage and talk about diversity in the C-suite, followed by Q&A and networking. So I'd like to call upon Julia. Julia is a director on the management board of Women in Banking and Finance. She heads marketing and diversity at the Pfizer Group. So that's two hats that she wears and wears them brilliantly. Julia, please come on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara, for that lovely introduction, and a great pleasure to be here today.
I'd like to introduce Angela Single. Angela is a non-exec director in digital strategy and transformation, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Foundation Trust. She chaired a joint Department of Health and Industry initiative in the UK 3 Million Lives. Over 2 decades of experience in health and technology market is what Angela brings on today. And she's had roles in Global Business Development Director in BT Health and has advised several health tech startups. Thank you, Angela. Please come over.
Thank you.
I would next like to invite David Wilson. David is a Director, Global Strategic Programs at Grant Thornton International. He's a passionate advocate for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, something I'm very passionate about as well, and particularly the gender equality goals. He brings with him 2 decades of experience of working with boards globally in the UK, North America, Africa, and Middle East, across the private sector and public sector and voluntary sector. So David, thank you. And now we have Dr. Michelle Ryan. She's the President Governing Board of Santa Clara Unified School District in California, US. She currently works in corporate learning and development in the Silicon Valley and has worked with companies such as Google and Applied Materials. She has extensive experience in education sector, corporate learning and development, and is my EMBA colleague. So, Michelle, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And then we have Dr. Simon Limon. Simon is a very special panelist because he is a professor for an executive MBA. He's a director for MBA program, Judge Business School. and he's a subject matter expert in corporate governance. He has a long-standing interest in business management and role of business in society, in Asian and in global markets. He's the winner of Cambridge Teaching Prize for pioneering new methods of learning, and you've seen that. So please come over, Simon. So, I'd like to share with the audience that most of the questions for this panel discussion have come from a survey which was distributed earlier. And yeah, we'll start from there. So we'll start off talking about each one of us are stakeholders in the board. So are our boards representative enough? So for starters, Simon, we'd like to ask you to share some thought on, do boardrooms even matter? And if at all, there is a secret sauce for a representative board?
Okay, thank you very much. So the question whether boards matter, there's actually been quite a lot of change in ideas about what boards represent and how important they are over the last 20 or so years. I think when I first started actually acting on a board and thinking about boards, there was an idea that they're just the kind of top level of management. That is no longer the case. The management is of course really, really important, but boards now play a fundamentally different and absolutely essential role in organisations, but also within society. Boards are responsible for the direction and control of companies. It's really important to bear that in mind, the direction and control of companies. In effect, what that means is they have three key purposes. They need to make sure that the strategy of firms is appropriate. They don't necessarily make the strategy. What they do is they develop it and they authorise the strategy for the firm. Secondly, they need to make sure that the companies are held accountable. That raises lots of important questions about accountable for what and to whom. We'll obviously go into these in more detail during the panel discussion, but accountability of organisations is absolutely critical nowadays. And then they're responsible finally for managing the managers, making sure that the people who are running the companies on a day-to-day basis are doing the right thing, that they're not running companies in their own interests, and they're not necessarily prioritising anyone's set of stakeholders' interests. So boards have this really, really, really important role now. It's not just about management. What that means is diversity is critical. Along all of those particular elements, those three elements, we've got to make sure that boards are diverse so that they can make sure that companies are held to account, make sure they perform well, and make sure that they have good strategies.
Thank you. And is there a secret sauce?
There's a secret sauce. Diversity is a secret sauce, and I think we'll probably develop this over the course of the next few questions, but it really, really is critical. I'd certainly develop that later on myself. But
thank you.
Hear from the other panellists.
So now, this event is from the Rising Tide, and we have three board members who are making waves, I would say. So please share your personal journey. Did the boards come to you, or you went to the boards to bring diversity onto them? So Angela, would you like to start?
So I'm both a trustee on a local charity. I'm just about to be chair in a local charity in Cambridgeshire, but I'm also, as you said, a non-exec director on the local NHS Trust Board. And for the NHS Trust Board, not the Trust Board itself, but an organisation called NHS Improvement approached me to join their trainee programme. So the NHS has highlighted, as many other organisations, that they don't have enough diversity on their trust boards. So I was approached and was fortunate enough to go on what they call their Next Director scheme, and you are matched with a local or a NHS trust, and then you have a mentor on that board, and you have regular training sessions by the NHS England. So that was my journey. I had a year being attached to the local NHS Trust, and then they asked if I would stay on with a portfolio of digital transformation as an associate director. So it's not a full director, it's a non-voting director, but that's been my journey, and my next part of the journey will be a full board member at an NHS Trust. And for my trustee role, I was approached by a friend on the board who felt that I had fit some of the things they were looking for in digital transformation in the charity as well.
Thank you. Michelle.
So I actually will be serving on 2 boards soon, but the nonprofit, the nonprofit like yours, they actually did have when I met with them, had a very explicit interest in having a diverse board, and so that's why she reached out to a women's leadership group I'm in. But the board I serve on now, where I'm the board president, is the school board. In the U.S., every public school, the state-sponsored schools, is governed by a local school board. It could be anywhere from a 1 school district all the way to something like New York City, where there's 1 million students that are in that school district. Most boards in the U.S. are elected, so it's an elected position that you go to the voters. I had a friend who was already serving on the board and felt like the district wasn't making enough progress, so she was like, "Come on, run for the board," and I was like, "Oh, please." I don't want to get involved in politics this year. I had a background in teaching, but I went ahead and decided to run because I saw, I got involved in politics on a local issue, and I saw some of the same things happening in the school district. So I took on, I ran against a woman. She was the current board president. I was a first-time candidate, and ended up, wasn't sure how I was going to do, but ended up beating her by 12 percentage points, which was a kind of a landslide in politics in the area. We do have a slightly diverse board. We're a 7-member board. We're 4-3, 4 men, 3 women. But I'm actually doing my individual project for our MBA program on women in board leadership. Had a great call last week with someone who works in the area as well. And we were talking about how there's a lot of industries, and teaching and education is one of them, where there's lots of women. Women are the vast majority at the school and classroom level. But as you go up higher in the levels of management, women don't seem to be there. And I think about our school district, where we just hired a female superintendent last summer. She started last summer. But I look at her cabinet, so her executive officers, and all but one are male. And so it's an interesting dilemma and an interesting perspective.
Thank you. And to you? Yourself?
I'm on the board for Women in Banking and Finance, which is a non-profit mostly run by volunteers. We have about 5,000 members across the UK. I've been a member for a number of years, and then applied for a voluntary role to join the team of the board director who is responsible for marketing. And typically the roles are sort of a 3-year commitment, and when that role became available, I was approached to take the role. And I think partly because I hadn't put myself forward, I sort of identified with a bit of imposter syndrome. I definitely think that sort of non-profit board service can be a brilliant way to gain senior leadership experience, which is obviously transferable back to the corporate sector, and it teaches you governance. And it's also a brilliant way to be able to give back as well.
Would you say your board is diverse?
Well, I think probably the name slightly gives it away. It's overwhelmingly female, but we have an advisory board and patrons who, and we have gender diversity across there. And we've just changed our constitution to encourage male allies to join the membership. And as a result of that, we've got our first male representative on the board, which is great. And the other thing that we're really focusing on at the moment is Black, Asian and minority ethnic group representation, which again we've achieved at advisory and patron level, but we really need to mirror across the rest of the board.
Thank you. Angela, coming back to you, would you say the NHS Trust Board that was
So I think it's getting there. So I think the schemes such as the one I've been on, certainly the gender diversity is there. So we have 4 women and 4 men. But certainly just as you were saying, our BME is not representative at all. And actually as a board, it's really been on our agenda. And we've been doing a lot of work with in the organisation with bringing more minority through the organisation, because actually neither at board level or through senior management in the organisation do we have that representation. So it's something that both on our agenda and through the organisation. So no, I would say definitely not yet, but getting there. And the NHS is really striving. It's just as in education.
Yeah. That was actually the other industry we talked about was healthcare.
So just in education, healthcare, you have a large female workforce and obviously a large BME workforce too, and it's really important that we talked about role models, to see role models at board level. And actually our last board meeting, we had a great challenge actually from one of the members of staff who was shadowing our FD. She was from a nation background, and she actually challenged our board because we're all sitting there around with white faces, and she's saying, why is that so? So it's definitely being talked about. We're not there yet.
Okay, thank you. So David, what do you think, are the key challenges to address gender diversity in the boardroom, especially because you have experience across multiple and global sort of segments and regions?
Well, I think I've seen 3 factors that might be described as challenges. I think the first thing is sort of psychological factors. And one of those is linking back to Julia's point about people hiring people who are like themselves. I think also linked to that, there can actually just be a lack of imagination amongst existing board directors. They've got where they are by doing things in certain ways. So there is a resistance to change. I think the second thing I've seen coming through in dialogue is sometimes a feeling that in order to improve diversity, there's a need to have a trade-off or compromise some other dimension. So that might be, for example, industry expertise. And personally, I believe that's false. I don't think there has to be a trade-off. I think the third thing I've seen is that a lack of board diversity is often a symptom of other problems within the organisation, particularly around leadership and succession planning. So I think that those are 3 key challenges I've observed, and that's across different regions. It's not specific to one part of the world.
Okay, that's good to know. Angela, would you like to give your view on that?
So I would totally agree with David. I think previously, certainly on NHS boards, we wouldn't have had even the male-female diversity. We traditionally had a large number of males on the board. And actually, it's having both the opportunity, and I do think the organisation has to recognise it and make changes. So I certainly would not have got to this position without having the support and training from NHS England. The fact that they reached out and are continuing to reach out for these training programmes, that's giving you because one minute I'm quite senior in industry, but to take that experience and put it into an NHS board, I think I needed support to do that. I think time and time again, we need that. So I think we really need to be able to offer those types of opportunities. I think the board has to recognise it. There has to be a mechanism to do that. But I also think you need to look outside the comfort zone, because actually the NHS, for example, previously found working with industry quite challenging. They didn't really know to handle that. They didn't know how to engage. And so I think it is also that thinking outside the box type of mentality. And going back to saying, not employing the same old. And so that diversity, we have people on the board who come from a motor industry, come from Kodak, but also that there are people in those industries that are being promoted, so that then can come across into something like an NHS board. So I think it has to be a multi-stakeholder approach, because it's not going to be one size fits all.
That's a very valid point. Simon, what would you like to add?
Yes, I think there has been great progress, but I don't want to throw too much of a spanner in the works, but it really is not fast enough or deep enough. I actually think it's very positive having this sort of forum. Thanks everyone for coming, but we should also be looking behind the numbers. It's not just the numbers there. There has been some progress. The first real discussion, substantive discussion about women on boards took place in 2010, so 10 years ago now. This was with the Davis report. And it was a sort of response to things that were going on in Europe at the time. Particularly Norway had decided to introduce a quota. They thought that you should have 40% women on boards. The UK pushed back from that and said, it's going to take time, we've got to bring people up through the ranks and so on and so forth. So let's have a target in 2020, so this year, of 33%. So in 10 years, we've gone from about 12.5%, it was between 10 and 12% in 2010, just up to 30% in October last year, 2019, just over 31% now. And this is in FTSE 100 companies. Okay, so there's been a focus on FTSE 100 companies. If you look at the FTSE 350, it's actually gone down recently in the last few years. If you look at the number of senior managers in organisations, that's actually gone down in the last 2 or 3 years. It's down at 19% in listed companies. So it seems to me that people are looking at these kind of headline targets and thinking, okay, we need to tick the box to make sure that happens. But whether there's any real kind of substantive change happening is something that really needs to be questioned, really deeply needs to be questioned. And it also then raises, also the Hampton-Alexander report, which Julie mentioned, is absolutely shocking. I mean, you said it very nicely, but it should make everyone really angry, I think. That, in 2017, we've got directors of companies saying, women are not smart enough to be on boards. Companies are too complex. I mean, how's that make you feel? I know how it makes me feel. And I'm not a woman. I think it's really kind of outrageous. So I think there's, the UK has made some progress. But if you look at France in 2017, they introduced a quota of 40%. They got to 43% this year. Norway's up at 42%. 43% in the CAC 40. So it's going up in other companies. But places like the US is terrible. 17%. I mean, really bad. Japan, 9%. Yeah, China, 12%. You look around the world, there hasn't really been a huge amount of movement. And it I think does call into question the implicit biases that we have, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of ethnicity, in terms of cognitive diversity, all these sorts of things. There are real problems, I think, that do need to be addressed. Some changes have taken place, but not enough. I think over the next 3 or 4 years, we really need to take action because it's what society needs. And picking up some of the points that were made here, when you get women on boards, when you get ethnic diversity, cognitive diversity on boards, you get people challenging, you get people being curious, asking difficult questions and so on. And that's how things start changing. You've got to challenge the assumptions that are there, kind of institutionalised in companies. Organisations are gendered, there's no question about it. So this is a change that's got to take place.
And I want to echo that really, because certainly in the SME field, and I work with a lot of SMEs, I would say I can think of 3 companies sitting here now that I was the only woman on the board. So my last executive position, I'm just leaving, there were 7 men and I was the only woman. And I'm working with an SME at the moment. There's 4 men and I'm the only woman. And I'm joining a new company and there's 5 men and I'll be the only woman. And so I completely agree with Simon. It's not at the next level. I think because the FTSEs, it's the light's been shining on them a bit. But I think there's whole rafts of companies out there who have not made any progress at all.
So I was going to add that California has become the first state in the U.S. to actually make a quota. Their quota is very low. It's any company that has a headquarters in California as of December 31st in 2019 was supposed to have one woman on the board, or face a $100,000 fine. And then by December 31st of next year, depending on the size of the board, have 2 or 3 women. But there was an article in the New York Times a month ago or so that said, some of these companies, especially the small startups, are sort of weighing it, saying, it's cheaper for us just to pay the fine than to get a woman on the board. So, and then the person I was talking to last week, we also talked about, how much of this is a box checking exercise and how much is the woman actually being able to contribute. And pointed out, and I read one of the reports in the UK, but also in the US, the tenure of women who join a board is much shorter. And particularly if they're the only woman on the board, they tend to not stay as long. And so there's a whole question there. But one of the things that she also pointed out to me was, while the quotas are helping, and Goldman Sachs then came out with the statement that they will not do a public offering for any company that doesn't have a woman on the board, but also some of the big, and I don't know if there's a parallel in the UK, but so our public employee unions are big investors in different companies, and they've started to look at board composition and the diversity of the board as because we know more diverse boards have more successful companies. If your board is not diverse, if you don't have, for example, if you're a tech company and you don't have someone who's an expert in cybersecurity on your board, that's actually a problem for your long-term value, and they're questioning their investment. And she was saying that that's also a lever that we don't necessarily see in the public, but that's a lever that's bringing more diversity into boards.
Thank you. Julia, would you like to add to that?
I very much agree with all of that. I read a really interesting report about the striking circumstances in which women are appointed to boards, which I think was University of Exeter, with the glass cliff phenomenon. And their researchers looked at FTSE companies who had appointed new board members. And for those companies that had appointed women, they were more likely to have had a consistently bad performance in the preceding 5 months versus organisations who hadn't appointed a woman. And this sort of, I think, links back with our perceptions of male and female roles in terms of women being more kind of caring and intuitive and perhaps better equipped to deal with stressed companies, which I just thought was a sort of fascinating turn on its head. But I think the quota question as well is really difficult because it's one that's so inherently tied up with merit, and I think certainly is someone being sort of appointed to that role because of their merit, or is it because
ticking the box?
Yes, ticking the box.
Oh, thank you for that. So now we address the elephant in the room. So how much gender diversity is too much diversity? Is this, the tick in the box exercise rather detrimental? If you're increasing focus on gender diversity, is there a risk that we are losing sight of diversity of thought or diversity of culture, for that matter?
It's a great question, and I think I can talk a little bit about what we use in my organisation internally. Just as a crude measure, we will sort of look at gender balance as being in the 45-55 band, so male, female between 45-55. That's how we would define sort of gender balance. I think one of the things that I'm starting to see coming through, though, and may lead to some challenges around this, is we are starting to get people coming into our workforce who are not happy with binary gender definitions. And so how do we handle that at the same time as not giving people a get out on the question we've been trying to improve in terms of female diversity? We're really at the very early stages of working through that point. I think you have got a point that if we focus solely on gender diversity, we risk losing other aspects of diversity, socioeconomic, ethnic. in my organisation, one of the reasons we focused, first of all, on gender diversity was simply that it was easier to measure. It was where we had data for the 140 countries where we have operations. It's much more difficult for us to collect data on ethnicity, religion, nationality. What that does mean in practical terms is that we sometimes have situations where a country that's quite ethnically homogeneous can sit there feeling virtuous because they have good gender diversity. Whereas I sometimes I'm working with colleagues in another country, the UAE is a great example, where they actually have tremendously ethnically and religiously heterogeneous group of employees, but they feel they don't get the same credit as some of the Scandinavian countries where it's white, very white, but there's a more even split between male and females. So I think that's some of the challenges that are coming through is actually how can we collect that data to make decisions upon and do it in a way that sort of avoids labelling people. The question about personality and diversity of thought is very interesting, and I'm not quite sure what we can do in that area. I think there is stuff that could be done with, for example, Big Five personality testing, different ways of thinking. But that really is getting into an area that's beyond my expertise right now.
Thank you, Simon. Perhaps we can leverage from your expertise here from this point.
It's a really, really, it's a good question, great question, a tricky one to answer. You can answer it in lots of different ways. One thing that I think sometimes comes up when we're talking to regulators and government, as well as boards about these kind of issues, is whether, I kind of hesitate to say this, but I'll say it anyway because this is going to be a provocative place, whether the numbers are saying one thing, but actually all you're getting is men in skirts with these numbers. Some people say, well, if you look at the background of a lot of these women, they're Oxbridge educated, they come from typically a particular social class. They actually aren't very diverse cognitively, which is something I think should be addressed, especially given what I was saying about what we know now about the importance of boards. I mean, if you really want diversity, if you want proper diversity, so you get great argumentation, curiosity, and pushback at the top level of the company, you have to have this difference. So we do need to find a way, I think, to make sure that on our boards we have this diverse representation. It can be about ethnicity, it can be about cultural background, certainly about diversity of thinking, cognitive background. But they are really difficult to measure. The thing is, as David rightly said, male-female is actually quite easy to measure. So we tend to measure what's measurable. But I think what we need to start doing is thinking about how to capture all these other. There's now a discourse going around intersectionality, which I think is quite useful. So just thinking about diversity in many different ways, and maybe that's that's a route forward.
Thank you. Michelle,
well, I was two things I was thinking. One was I attended a talk last week with Tina Chen, who founded the Time's Up movement, and the question sort of came up about, well, how much is too diverse? And her answer was sort of, well, when we start appointing incompetent women to boards, then maybe we can have a discussion. But I was thinking also, as we talk about cognitive diversity, one of the books I've been reading is Brotopia, about the development of the tech industry, largely male, largely controlled by men. And one of the interesting parallels she draws is that Sheryl Sandberg became part of Facebook fairly early on. And the privacy controls in Facebook were much stronger than on Twitter, for example. So there was something called Gamergate, where the woman involved was getting death threats and people were stalking her and finding her address and sharing it on Twitter. Because they hadn't set up these privacy controls. They wanted to be a free and open space where anyone could say anything. And Sheryl at Facebook was much more concerned about understanding it from where women might be concerned about sharing information, where people could tag you and you couldn't untag yourself, things like that. And she was really instrumental in setting up the controls that are there in Facebook. And so thinking about what that diversity means in terms of the end product as being very important.
Thank you. And then with your experience across multiple boards in Europe, Asia, and US, that's for you, David. Do regional factors really impact boardroom performance with diversity? I think you've partly answered that.
Yeah, I mean, it does vary.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say between countries based on my own observations. I think the other thing, if you're actually focusing on performance, is that I know from working with global boards with many different nationalities on them, people bring their own experience of what a board is like in their country, and they assume that's how a global board should work.
Yeah.
So a colleague from Germany with the supervisory and the management board will have a very different perception of how a board should work than a North American colleague. I think one of the characteristics I see a lot from my North American colleagues is they're used to having a CEO and chairman, who's often a very powerful figure. In the UK, maybe a more balanced approach. So one of the things I have observed when I've seen global boards with different nationalities is there's often an education process to go through how that particular board ought to work based on best practice and based on the specific national legislation, whatever the head office entity is created.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to add something onto that?
So I've had experience on a Japanese board as well as a UK board. So just thinking about the Japanese experience, there's, there is clear, in my view, apologies to the Japanese people here, but clear tokenism in some countries. Some legislation has been introduced in the last few years in Japan saying that we ought to have more gender diversity on the board. So most companies have found a woman and put her on the board. Whether she's allowed to contribute or not is another question.
A silent factor.
So I think where you are in the world matters enormously, but it then kind of just raises this question about quotas and tokenism and all these sorts of things, which I think it's a really important issue to think about and actually to research more of. My own senses, and this actually comes from interviewing many women who have taken board roles over the last 10 years, is that, and there's one person particularly in the front of my mind, I won't say who it is, who was on the board of Barclays, who was approached because they wanted a woman. And her first response was, no, I don't think I'll do that. I don't want to be, to take a board position simply because I'm a woman. But she had long conversations and they talked about, the contribution she could make and so on. And she decided to take it. And she said, actually, it was a really, really good decision in the end, although it was kind of uncomfortable at first, being one of the first women on this kind of board. Because what she was then there. She was in the room. She was actually able to do something. So she said, you've got to separate the reason for getting there and actually what you can contribute when you're there. So, to break down the doors is the first thing, like suffragettes in the way, and people coming into this university, you've got to get in first, and then you can kind of make the change. So it doesn't really matter how you get in; just kick the door in. Is my advice. And once you're in there, then you can start changing the culture and trying to challenge the bias and so on. So in some ways, it's a kind of moot point, about tokenism and all that kind of stuff. Just get in there and do it.
Get the representation. Okay.
I hope it happens in Japan. It will slowly happen.
Okay. So coming back to Michelle's point, that's actually one of our questions. That so Goldman Sachs said in Davos earlier last month that they will no longer do an IPO for companies with all male boards. What are your thoughts on that, David?
Well, I watched the the interview where David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, made the announcement. And I've got some observations from that. I think, firstly, it was interesting how he positioned it. He made very clear that his first priority was the Goldman Sachs shareholders. He used that word. Our first priority is. I think he then also positioned it as being, this is the right advice for our clients. So the clients being companies that are IPOing. And then he linked it to the outperformance of US companies that have at least one female director. I think what he then did after that was then to speak about his personal experience working with Goldman Sachs board. So I think 4 out of 11 female senior director is black, I believe, or African American. I thought altogether that was quite powerful, but I thought it was interesting that at no point was it justified in terms of this is the right thing for society. It was very much grounded in good, solid economic arguments. So he did also bring in that little bit of emotion, speaking about his own experience. I'm not sure if you're going to push me on this, but I am actually supportive of Goldman Sachs' move on that. I think it's a good thing to do. It's the right thing for the clients, but I think it's also the right thing for society. It might have been nice if he'd felt a little more comfortable about making the societal point.
We'll let Julia decide whether we should push on that note or not.
I think also just really worth noting that they will still do IPOs for all male boards because their new policy covers board members who qualify as diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. So, I think it's a really positive move, and I think one that reflects that CSR and ESG is becoming increasingly prominent. I mean, certainly in financial services, it's huge. Probably led by all the recent legislation. So I think it's a really encouraging move, and I thought it was fantastic that he was linking it to the business case when he made the announcement. I think it's so important that we keep banging the drum that this is a business issue, and that's why it needs to be part of board governance. It's not a women's issue, it's not HR, it's absolutely the business case. And I think if I was going to be very cynical, I would I would probably make a bit more of the fact that the new policy only applies to the US and Europe. Asia was remarked in its absence, as was Middle East and which is obviously where there's a lot more work to be done. I think I'd be interested to see how much it actually affects their bottom line. I think Bloomberg did some research into the companies that Goldman's took public last year, and of the 59 companies, there was only 18 that didn't have a woman on the board. And of course, some of those might still be diverse in terms of the other characteristics. So I do just slightly wonder how much.
Should we
I'd like to see the data.
Can I develop a couple of things there? Because I think this is a really, really important area, and it's something we're going to hear a lot more of in the coming year, actually. I mean, in fact, it was a topic of huge debate and discussion at Davos, which finished last week, and it's to do with the power of the investment community in these kind of debates. And the Goldman example is a really, really good one, but arguably a more important one is the recent kind of announcements from Larry Fink of BlackRock. BlackRock is the biggest investment company in the world, along with Vanguard and Reliance and so on. BlackRock has come out saying this is the number one priority for it now. Making sure that companies are, in all of their actions, thinking about environmental issues, social issues, governance issues. These are the ESG ideas. And amongst those, gender diversity is one of those, really, really important issues that they're going to focus attention on. And they are now asking their analysts to actively go to the companies and say, what are your policies? What are your results here? And that is so Larry Fink writes what he calls his letter to CEOs each year, which he did 2 weeks ago. mentioning all of these things and saying that diversity is going to be a priority for them, it's really, really important because they can bring the pressure to the companies. There is then a question, though, which David and Julia were kind of talking about, which I think is also very important, whether this is just really serving their own interests. Actually, is it because this kind of risk is systemic risk for them? So they're managing these massive portfolios. Are ESG and gender issues just systemic risks? So they need to kind of, take care of them to make sure they protect their ability to generate profit and money returns. So interesting work there. In the end, it doesn't really matter because they're doing it. Yeah, so it's got to be a good thing. It's got to be a good thing. I do sometimes question their motives, but if the result is good, that's fine.
And I think it'll have a ripple effect. I really do. So I work a lot with small companies and small investors, and I think it'll have that ripple effect. So if the big companies are asking for that kind of diversity, to see that in their boards when they're investing, I think that will have a ripple effect right across organisations, right down to the SMEs. I think it's a really interesting move, and hopefully it will have that ripple effect.
And hopefully it will set a trend.
Absolutely.
Well, moving on to our way forward. So what would you like to recommend as a or share some closing thoughts on how should we bridge the gap in the boardrooms when it comes to gender diversity? So, Angela, would you like to?
Yes, it's something we've talked a lot about in my NHS board, and we've talked about two different things. One is role modelling, but also reverse mentoring. So we've looked at both of those to see whether or not that's a way of increasing our diversity and making sure that we give opportunities for mentoring ourselves, and we go out and talk to people and talk about our story, where we're encouraged to share our story about how we get to board meeting, but also reverse mentoring is something we've been doing as well. So I think you continually have to be proactive and do things like this, be proactive and getting out there and meeting people and talking about your story is really important.
That's really interesting. So have you been involved in the reverse mentoring exercise?
Some of the other board members have. I haven't, but it's something I really want to explore going forward.
Wonderful. I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah.
So, Michelle?
The couple of things. I know maybe similar to the program that you did, there's a lot of, and I think especially connected to SB 8, it's Senate Bill 826, which is the board diversity law in California. Okay. So lots of universities and other organizations are developing board readiness programs, particularly for women. So the local business school at the Santa Clara University, which is in my hometown, has a board readiness workshop for women. A women's leadership group I'm a part of, I'm doing later this month, I'm going to do a board simulation exercise with them, because again, they're helping women to develop the skills that they might need to serve on a board. From my perspective, I think school boards, as I look around, I haven't looked at every one of them. They seem, I don't know of a single school board that's entirely male. But I think in politics in general, women, there is not, beyond the school board level, and my school board is not, it's a 7-member board, so we're going to be 4-3 of, the best we can do is 4-3. But moving on from that, there's, women face harder, more obstacles in moving on to other offices. And school board is a common place for people to start if they're looking at higher office. Lots of politicians start at the school board level. And so there's some organizations that help women raise money, particularly focused on women, preparing women to run for higher office or to help them raise money. But I think those are areas to look at for diversity in politics and leadership there.
And simulation exercises sound wonderful. Simon?
I would really endorse what Michelle said. I mean, I think it's true for men and women, but I'll say why, particularly for women in a sec. But I think, starting off with something that you kind of know and is kind of close to your heart, or whatever, seems to be quite important if you aspire to board positions. So start with a sports team that you're involved with, or a school, or a local charity, but don't limit your kind of ambition. See it as a kind of stepping stone. I've interviewed many women board members over the years, and actually almost all of them started off with something that was kind of quite close to their heart and kind of locally close to them, but then sort of built up. I said, it's particularly true for women. I think one thing, we talked about it a little bit before we kind of came up here, is women tend to lack confidence insofar as it comes to joining boards. And it's not that surprising. I mean, the image that we have of boards is old, grey-haired men. And they tend to be seen as being kind of quite assertive and aggressive, shouty sort of places. That's not conducive to good board business. So, we need to kind of, change what's happening on the boards. And one of the ways to do that is actually to get more women in. In the end, though, it's about changing the system. There are practical steps to kind of make, as I say, break down the doors. But in the end, it's about changing the system. So I think everyone, men and women, need to be much more assertive about understanding how gendered organisations are and how gendered particularly boards are. And just saying that's not good enough. It wasn't good enough when, this university was, existing in the 19th century. With all of its prejudice and exclusion, why should organisations and boards be acceptable nowadays in that respect? So yeah, that's, I think, the way forward. Rise up.
I was going to advise. The New York Times article I mentioned talked about companies looking, as they're trying to recruit women to fill these roles, looking at women who have had board service on a nonprofit or a school board. I mean, in my school board, our annual budget is $280 million. We have $1.1 billion in bonds outstanding. So we manage quite a bit of finances, and and we're not alone in that.
Yeah. That's quite some figures.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to open the floor to for further questions from the audience. So we have mics. Thank you. And we have a question.
Yes. So, hi. Basically, I think I can talk like. So actually, I have a question about the last question. So that now the economic growth is slowing down. Basically, the companies are moving from being focused on how to grow to how to make the companies more profitable. So if we're talking about growth, so yes, it some kind of like involves imagination and creativity on the things. It's like, yes, I think that this is where the woman can actually contribute a lot. But if we are talking about like profitability, so it's basically usually cutting costs and make the business more operational. And I think it's like a bit more like on the male side. So what do you think about that one, this trend, how it can influence the ability of women to be on the board, if there are like any kind of impact coming from that one?
Who would like to take that?
I'm happy to have a quick go, which is. I mean, I think there is evidence to show that in the early stages, companies need to have very, very clear focus on developing their technology and making sure that the business, takes advantage of the markets it's in and so on. It's very, very competitive. It doesn't really matter whether you're a man or a woman, but going to Michelle's point, what we've seen in the tech industry, particularly in the States, is lots of men doing that kind of quite well. And the growth, as you say, has been massive in many cases. But actually in the later stages of development of companies, and I think you're right in terms of developed economies, you can kind of say the same things. What you need is not that drive and aggressive competitiveness at the top of the company so much. What you need is you need people who know what's going on in society and are able to bring those conversations into the board, and that means diversity. It means questioning and so on. That's what we see. If we look at I mean, it's a little bit technical, but if we look at the way that dual class shares perform over time, so you can issue shares with control rights and non-control rights, and typically the Facebooks and the Ubers and so on, they favour splitting the shares so that people who founded the company have this control and are able to kind of continue to drive the growth forward. And that seems to work for a time, but then it actually peters off. And what we're seeing in companies like Facebook and Uber is actually you need to diversify the board because the game has changed. Yeah? Growth is not the same as sustainability and general doing good things for the firm. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there is an argument to say diversity is really important for later stage companies and later stage economies. That's my 2 pence worth.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk, guys. I was wondering how you think women can escape from tokenism on boards, because I know a lot of times like they will be put in roles of like head of people or head of HR, and like how can they? You talked a little bit on that, but if you can just expand.
Well, I think in some of the research I've been doing, they talk about looking at roles where women traditionally can move to the highest role in that kind of role within the organization, so HR, for example, and that it can be very CEO dependent on whether that person, the chief people officer, is considered part of the executive team or not. I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I think that's, maybe someone else can take it from there. I don't know.
I also think it's, if you're talking about executive roles opposed to non-executive roles, I think it also depends on your CEO. So I can think of a large technology company I worked for that actually had a woman CEO, and so she was very pro bringing other women up through the ranks at any types of any type of role, because she had risen through the ranks. It was a very male-dominated organisation, but she had risen to the top, and she was really, really supportive of other women rising to the top of the organisation as well in executive roles. And I think that's what I mean about. We have responsibility when we do become either executives or non-execs or both, or senior managers, to put support back down the organisations for our female colleagues. There is, I belong to a female network, and there's a little saying there that there's a special place in hell for women, senior women, that don't support other women to the organisation. I think, that's a big responsibility, but I passionately believe that we do and should share our story and our support and offer mentoring. So you have, I think as we get to those senior roles, as examples of that CEO, we have a role to support other women getting through the organisation as well.
And I hope we means men as well.
Yeah.
But I think to HR specifically, I mean, that was one of the things I've been looking at, is that boards now, as they talk about diversity, it's also diversity of experience. And so the woman I talked with last week who is part of an organization, How Women Lead, that companies are now thinking we actually need someone who has experience in HR to be on the board, to be able to advise on those issues and to have that perspective. Because of things that I think particularly about tech industry, you see some of the CEOs that have had to walk away because there was no one there at the board level who was like, you can't be doing things like that.
Yeah, I think I was more in respect to like, if there's a woman on executive, like she's stuck in HR, like not that there aren't.
It's true. I think the number, I just actually had made a note of it. I think in the UK, about 10% of CFOs are women, and less than 5% of CEOs women in the UK. One is a Cambridge grad, business school grad, Alison Britton at Whitbread, who's doing a fantastic job. But you're right. I mean, it tends to be women are not in those kind of the hard, the strategy, the finance and accounting kind of positions, and it's something that does need to be addressed. And it's to this point. It's not just at the boards. I mean, boards is important because it's visible, but it's in all of the ranks kind of coming up. We've got a problem which we haven't mentioned either of women being overboarded. and also they tend to have non-exec roles. So the data looks like, oh, it's going in the right direction, it's nice, we're making progress. But actually, it's the same women just taking multiple positions, which of course makes it even more difficult for them to contribute properly, because the current thinking is you shouldn't really have more than probably 3 board roles if you're going to do them effectively. So we need to celebrate the changes that are taking place. They're fantastic, but there's a whole lot more work that needs to be done.
I guess this is just once again based on sort of experience of what I've seen, but where I've seen very successful female leaders who've gone up to C-suite roles or CEO roles, and they've come through an HR kind of background, what they've often done is, because so many organisations now are matrix organisations, so they may be split by geography, function, market, they've always done HR plus something. So they'll have responsibility for a geography, or they'll have a P&L responsibility, a profit and loss responsibility. So they can actually show that they're involved in the commercial side of the business, because that gives them, essentially it's power. It gives them more power than if they were solely just in the, what you might call the HR silo.
And also to add on, I was to talk at Downing the other day, and we had the UN climate crisis representative out there, and she was saying that, to your point, that women are leading areas like ESG or education, which were considered more okay, or HR more okay for women. But the way they have created those incubators and shined out of it, to all the panelists' points earlier, it's about getting that first step in the door and then spreading your wings across. So given Simon was mentioning that 2010 was the first time the conversation about women in boardroom actually became serious, we are just 10 years ahead now. So I think gradually the wings are going to spread across because they've proved them in these areas.
Hi, I come from a science background, and I had my own company. I was a CEO, and I was tired of running it alone, and I shut it down after 12 years. And my husband is a business investor here in SM startup companies. One of the things that I seem to understand is women that sit on these boards mainly come from a business background. And I wonder if you have any information in your research of women who come from different backgrounds that don't understand much about finance or economics, but for example, I'm a biologist and a psychologist, and I think that I would have a lot to contribute in terms of animal behavior or human behavior, which are animals. and I wonder if you have data on the educational background of these women that sit in boards.
So as far as I know, there isn't that kind of research hasn't been carried out. But anecdotally, we know that the women who tend to get board positions in the big, certainly listed companies, are kind of quite a narrow group. They are people who tend to have finance and accounting backgrounds. They are people who tend to have Oxbridge backgrounds. Again, I don't know whether I can say this. They tend to have house husbands. Things like this. It's there are anecdotally these kind of profiles, which are things which I think need to be seriously addressed, because we are missing out on a huge number of really, really talented, really, really experienced people with a diversity of views, which is what is required now in our companies. We absolutely desperately need this. So one of the problems is that appointments to the board, I'm talking particularly of listed companies here, but to some extent it relates to big private companies and so on. Appointments to the board come from there's usually an appointments committee on the board, but it needs to then go to the annual general meeting and voted on by shareholders. So the group, the slate that is presented to the shareholders has to be kind of credible in their terms. Yeah, and what that usually means is they know about finance, they know about accounting, they're able to sign off. One of the key duties you have as a director is to sign off the annual report and accounts. So you've got to have some kind of financial knowledge. So the system kind of means that those backgrounds aren't appreciated as they should be. But again, that's why we need kind of change. In the short term.
Do you have any introductory courses at the business school?
Of course we do. Yes. Come and talk to me after.
The best courses.
Francesca, do we have, how many questions can we take? Okay.
Maybe two more.
Two more?
Hi, first of all, just thank you very much for a very thought-provoking discussion, and certainly left me with more questions, but that's the whole idea. I spend a lot of time working with intrinsic motivation and work in organisations to identify what teams and organisations as a whole have missing in terms of some of the motivators. And what's really interesting is that I looked probably a few days ago now at an article, I think it was American actually, that was undertaken. It was a large study looking at motivators, preferences and values, and had identified that male preferences tend to be more commercial and more money orientated, whereas the females are more affiliation and connecting with others. And I think my question is with regards to if those things are generally, and I mean, certainly from the work I do, I see a very diverse, I see quite a lot of females with that commercial, but the general study identifies that our board's more commercial achievement focused, and therefore we need to start looking at the skill sets and perhaps the motivators of the board to address perhaps some of the issues at root cause.
Well, I think one of the articles that Simon sent me talked about like the leadership pathway that women take as opposed to men as moving into board roles, and that the men, you know, again, it's not all one, all the other, but tended to have more of like I'm going to be the chief counsel of a company by the time I'm 40 years old. Like there's a very clear, whereas the women were more focused on the job that they were doing and just interested in the work and gradually moved up that way and hadn't really set that as a target. And then when I talked to the woman last week who works with women in board leadership in the US, she said her experience of talking with women board members sort of mirrored that as well, that they weren't necessarily focused on that goal. I'm going to get on that board by the time I'm 45 or whatever.
Yeah, what are the benefits?
Right.
Perhaps some of the motivators that are missing.
Yeah. That's what I had to add to that question.
Does it answer your question?
Yeah.
Hi, I don't have a grand introduction, but I was just wondering what your thoughts might be with regards to young people being in terms of growth and being the next generation, or what key messages on this topic would you have if you had the chance to talk to that demographic?
Get ready for the vote.
I have an opinion on this because one of the things we've not talked at length about is activism. So we touched a little bit upon Goldman Sachs, and I think there's a big role for activism and providers of capital. You've then got activism as consumers, and that's something that I think at some point we may see more of, where consumers choose to buy from organisations that are demonstrably more diverse in their boards. But the most powerful piece of activism that I'm seeing coming through at the moment is employee activism. So you've got employees at Amazon posting on medium.com, the blogging site, talking about how they oppose its moves in surveillance technology, warehouse conditions, climate change. And I think that could be one of the main drivers, or one of the main mechanisms by which young people can exert change at board level. I think the other thing is just go out and start a company, shape the company in the way you want it to be designed as a young person. Many of you will be studying here at Cambridge, which is a great, It's a great gift, a great privilege. So, do something useful with it, start a company and put that board together where you want it.
Very solid point.
Yeah, I would really endorse that and say, there's a little nagging voice at the back of me. I did some research in another country looking at this kind of thing. It was actually around employee involvement in things going on in companies. And what we found was the youngsters tended to be kind of very outspoken and quite active and so on. But then as they kind of got incorporated into the organisation, got a bit older, got a mortgage, all that kind of thing, it all kind of tailed off. I hope that young people now can continue to be really, really active and use, in particular, all of the social media that are around at the moment. This is something that was not around, even 7 years ago, and certainly wasn't used in the same way that it is now. You now have a channel that can actually force people to listen. So use all the channels of communication that are around at the moment, and then be active, but stay with it, stick with it. So when you start getting, the jobs in, whichever companies you go and work for, you continue to kind of do things. Don't let it kind of drop off. That's my thought on that. Okay.
There are some best practice companies to look at how they're doing the right way to do
Um,
you think of 2 or 3?
Diageo.
Southwest Airlines.
It's really the companies that are sort of linking it to executive pay. And Diageo has 5 people who haven't complied with the policies that they put in place for encouraging gender balance throughout the company. So I think it's those sort of quite bold companies that are seeing successes.
Yeah.
I think it's well, I think it's also interesting just to look at B Corps, because that is systemic change. So we're kind of sometimes talk about the FTSE 100, but I think also if you look at the B Corp movement, there's a lot of best practices there that even if you don't go down the B Corp certification route, are things that you can take into your own business.
Yeah. And I'd say don't believe the hype. Don't believe, to quote Public Enemy, don't always look at the videos and fancy brochures and so on, because companies are really good at saying they do this stuff. They really, really are. They've got it down to a T. I teach a case at the moment around Carillion, which collapsed last year. It had the most beautiful video about how wonderful it was, and was just interested in making as much money as it could and screwing the pension fund and screwing the employees and so on. The thing that you can believe is the tone from the top. It's the behaviour of the directors. Yeah, you watch what they do, you watch how they act rather than what they say. And I think that's the key. It's difficult to do unless you've kind of got your eye on things in some detail. But if you're going for a job, for example, see how they act. See what they're actually doing.
I can think, and I haven't done a lot of research on these 2 companies, but they came up in the conversation I had last week, and both have a similar founding story. Bumble, they're both US companies, Bumble and Stitch Fix, both founded by women, had trouble getting funding, and have grown into big companies. Bumble actually apparently has started their own investment fund to help support other companies like them, and Stitch Fix, again, the same thing. They got turned down for funding again and again because this came up in the Brotopia book of men were like, well, who would do that? Didn't understand the perspective of women, so they didn't fund them, and so they ended up bootstrapping themselves. And I know that one of their board members is someone on my contact list that I'm interviewing in the week or so. So, but I haven't looked entirely too much at their board, so I don't know that I can recommend them as best practices, but I know they have similar founding stories.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Francisca and her team as well. Thank you to the lovely panelists for starting an amazing dialogue, and I hope that the audience here and myself, we take back some interesting takeaways from this dialogue, and in line with the rising tide, we step out of here and make some waves in the world of diversity and inclusion. And lastly, I'd really appreciate if you could give us some feedback. We'll also release the podcast for this session on March 8th, International Women's Day. So spread it with your wider networks. And thank you for coming. Welcome to the